They finally know his name. After more than 70 years, a body found on a beach near Adelaide has a name, a birthplace, and a life that ended in 1948 with no one to claim it. DNA did what a whole generation of detectives could not, and the moment they solved who he was, the case got stranger. Because a name does not explain the poison, or the labels cut out of his suit, or the line of code written in a book of poetry, or the phone number of a woman who swore she had never seen his face. There is a plaster cast of a man's face sitting in South Australia. It was made from the body itself, pressed onto the dead man's head and shoulders before they buried him, so that someone, someday, might know him. For years it sat in storage. People walked past it without knowing what they were looking at. But locked inside that plaster were a few strands of human hair. And those hairs held the one thing the man, or the person who left him on that beach, had worked very hard to erase. This is the case of the Somerton man, the story of how he was found, why no one could name him, and how a professor with no police training spent the better part of his own life pulling that name out of a single strand of hair. We are going to walk the whole file, from the morning on the beach to a family tree 4,000 names deep, and end on the questions the DNA still has not answered. Somerton Park Beach, just south of Adelaide, the 1st of December, 1948. At around 6:30 in the morning, a man's body was found lying against the seawall. He was on his back, ankles crossed, head tilted toward the stone, in the position of someone who had simply fallen asleep and not woken up. He was middle-aged and fit, dressed in a white shirt and tie, a brown knitted pullover, and a jacket. His shoes were oddly clean and shiny, as if he had barely walked at all. The people who found him were not the first to see him there. The evening before, a couple walking the same stretch of sand had noticed a man lying in that exact spot. He moved his arm, or seemed to, and they decided he was drunk or asleep and kept walking. By morning, he had not moved at all. There was no wallet on him, nothing to say who he was. In his pockets, police found a comb, a packet of chewing gum, a box of matches, a pack of cigarettes, an unused second-class train ticket, and a used bus ticket. Ordinary things. The kind of things any man might carry. But there was nothing with his name on it. And there was something else the detectives noticed almost right away. Every clothing label had been removed. The tags on his jacket, the maker's marks on his trousers, anything that might trace back to a shop or a tailor, all of it had been cut away with a blade. A doctor was called in to examine the body. The doctor found a healthy man in his 40s, well built, with calf muscles that were unusually high and built up, the kind you might see in a dancer or someone used to wearing raised heels. His organs were swollen. His spleen was larger than normal. His stomach held the leftovers of a recent meal, and there were signs that pointed toward poison. The problem was that no poison could be found. The doctor was sure the man's death had come from something fast-acting that broke down in the body and left no trace behind. He had simply never seen anything do this and leave nothing. So the police had a dead man with no name, no labels, and no cause of death they could find. They turned to the one solid thread they had. The unused train ticket pointed to the man arriving in Adelaide the day before. The bus ticket pointed to where he had gone after that. And a check of the city's train station turned up a suitcase, left in the luggage room, that no one had come back to collect. The suitcase was almost surely his. Inside it, the same thing happened again. Most of the labels had been stripped from the clothes. A few items had been missed, and on those, police found a name stenciled into the cloth. The name was Keene. T. Keene. For a brief moment, it looked like a break in the case. Police searched the country for anyone named T. Keene who matched the body. They found nothing. No missing person, no record, no family. The name led nowhere, and the detectives quietly decided it might not have been his name at all. For months, the case sat cold. The body was preserved and kept while they waited for someone to claim it. No one did. They buried him under a headstone that read, simply, that here lay the unknown man found at Somerton Beach. And then a detail came up that turned a body no one could name into one of the strangest puzzles in the country's history. A second, closer look at the trousers found something the first check had missed. Sewn into the waistband was a small hidden pocket, the kind sometimes called a fob pocket. Rolled up tightly inside it was a scrap of paper. On the paper were two printed words. Tamam, Shud. The words are Persian. They mean ended or finished, and they were not handwritten. They had been torn from the printed final page of a book. To be exact, the last page of a famous book of poetry called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, written by a Persian poet nearly 1,000 years ago. The poems are about death, about living fully because life is short, about the idea that when it is over, it is simply over. Tamam, Shud. The closing line. Someone had carried that single phrase, hidden against his body, to the place where he died. Police asked the public for help. They asked whether anyone owned a copy of the Rubaiyat with the final page torn out, and someone came forward. A local man explained that, around the time of the death, he had found a copy of the book tossed into the backseat of his car, parked not far from the beach. He had thought nothing of it until he heard the call for help. The torn edge on the last page of his copy matched the scrap from the dead man's pocket exactly. This was the book, and the book carried more than the missing page. On the inside back cover, under a close look, faint marks appeared, as if someone had written on a sheet pressed against it. There were two things. The first was a line of capital letters, grouped in a way that looked on purpose, that looked like a message in code. For years, code experts, military experts, and amateur code breakers would try to crack those letters. No one ever has, at least not in any way that holds up. Some experts now argue the letters are not a code at all, that the spacing and the way they repeat do not act like a secret code in any system we know. The second set of marks was a pair of phone numbers. One led nowhere, the other was a private local number, and when police tracked it, it led to a house roughly 800 meters from where the body was found. The number belonged to a young nurse. Her name was Jessica Thompson, though she went by Jo. She was married, with a young child. When detectives came to her door and asked whether she knew anything about the dead man, she said she did not. She could not explain how her private number had ended up written in the back of a stranger's book of poetry. She gave the police one lead. During the war, she had owned a copy of the Rubaiyat, and she had given it away to an army officer she knew, a lieutenant named Alf Boxall. For a while, the detectives thought they had their man. Maybe the body on the beach was Boxall. It was not. Boxall was found alive and well, still holding his own copy of the book, with its last page still there. Another thread pulled, leading nowhere. But there was a moment in that case that no one ever fully explained. To make sure who the man was, or rule it out, police had made a plaster cast of the dead man's face and upper body, a death mask, built by a worker named Paul Lawson. They brought Jessica Thompson in and showed her the cast. According to the detective in the room, the moment she saw the face, she went pale, looked close to fainting, and turned away. She would not look at it again. She kept saying she did not know him. The police, for reasons that are still argued about today, did not push her further. She walked out, and she kept that reaction to herself for the rest of her life. The pieces sat there for a generation. A fit man, taken by a poison no one could name, his labels cut away, a scrap of dark poetry about death hidden against his skin, a line of letters no one could crack, and a woman who seemed to know a face she swore was a stranger, living a short walk from where he died. The theory that took hold was spying. The late 1940s were the opening years of the Cold War. South Australia was home to a secret rocket testing range in the desert, the kind of place a foreign government would have wanted to watch. A fit, nameless man, with his name carefully wiped away, and a poison in his body that no one could find, fit the shape of a spy story almost too well. For years, the main idea about the Somerton man was that he was a spy, silenced by someone who knew exactly how to do it cleanly. There was a second theory, quieter and closer to home. It grew around Jessica Thompson's son. Thompson had a boy named Robin, born in 1947, a year before the body appeared. As Robin grew up, people who studied the case noticed something. He shared two rare body features with the dead man. The first was the shape of his ears, where the upper hollow was larger than the lower one, a feature found in a very small slice of the population. The second was a tooth feature, where some of his upper teeth were simply missing. Both features are unusual on their own. Together, in two people who were not related, they are rare enough that researchers began to wonder whether the men were related at all. The suggestion was direct. Maybe the Somerton man was the father of Jessica Thompson's son. Maybe that was why her number was in his book, and why her face went white when she saw the cast. Both Jessica and Robin died before any of this could be tested. She passed in 2007. He died 2 years later. The face in the plaster and the body in the ground kept their secret, which is where a man named Derek Abbott comes in, and where the case stops being a story about detectives and becomes a story about hair. Abbott was not a police officer. He was a professor of electrical and electronic engineering at the University of Adelaide. He first read about the Somerton man in 1995 in a magazine while waiting at a laundromat. The case stuck in his head the way it sticks in a lot of people's heads. He set it aside for years. Then, around 2007, he read about the torn poetry and the code, and he could not leave it alone. He became, by his own words, obsessed. Abbott understood something the first detectives could not have. The answer might not be in the code or the book or the woman. It might be in the body itself. He spent years pushing for the man's body to be dug up and tested. In 2021, after years of being told no, that finally happened. The body was lifted from its grave under police guard and taken to a crime lab, but the body had been in the ground for more than 70 years, and building a clean DNA profile from it was slow, hard work. So Abbott went back to the death mask. When Paul Lawson made that cast in 1949, he had pressed wet plaster right onto the dead man's head and neck, and in doing so, he had trapped several strands of the man's own hair in the hardening plaster. The cast had been sitting in storage for over 50 years with a piece of the man stuck in it the whole time, and almost no one had thought of it as evidence. In 2012, with permission, a hair expert named Jeanette Edson worked under a magnifying glass to find a point where several strands came together, and to pull single hairs free without snapping them or harming the cast. From those hairs, over years of patient work, a usable DNA profile slowly came together. A profile, on its own, is just a string of data. It cannot tell you a name. To turn it into a name, Abbott brought in an American family tree expert named Colleen Fitzpatrick, who used DNA to crack cold cases that everyone else had given up on. This is the part of the case that still does not feel real. Fitzpatrick took the dead man's DNA profile and loaded it into a public DNA website, the same kind ordinary people use to find distant cousins. The system returned matches. Not close relatives, but faint DNA cousins, people who shared a tiny bit of DNA with the man on the beach. From those distant cousins, she began building outward, tracing marriages and births and deaths, building a huge family tree. By the time she was done, that tree held roughly 4,000 people. Somewhere in those 4,000 names was the Somerton man. The work was finding which one. Fitzpatrick and Abbott checked the tree against everything known about the body: the rough age, the body type, the time period, the likely link to the state of Victoria. And one name kept surviving every test. A man who, unlike almost everyone else in those records, had a beginning but no recorded end. No death certificate, no grave. No trace of him after the late 1940s, as if he had simply walked off the edge of the paperwork. In the spring of 2022, they had the name as a strong suspect. By the 23rd of July that year, Abbott said the final DNA proof was in place. They had connected the dead man's DNA to relatives on both his mother's side and his father's side. That double match is what closes the door. It is very hard to argue with. The Somerton man was Carl Webb. Some records carry the name Charles as well. Webb was born on the 16th of November, 1905, in a suburb of Melbourne. He was the youngest of 6 children. He grew up to become an electrical engineer and an instrument maker, a man who worked with fine, exact tools. The few details that survive show a quiet, private person. He loved poetry, which fits a man who would carry a torn page of verse to his death. He was described as something of a loner. He liked to bet on the horses, and that detail may explain the code. Code experts had spent years trying to read those letters as a secret message and getting nowhere. Abbott offered a simpler reading. If Webb was a gambler, the line of capital letters in the back of his book may not be a code at all. They may be the first letters of horse names, jotted down the way any gambler scribbles a short list. Not a secret, a betting note. It is a quieter answer than a spy code, and it cannot be proven, but it fits the man the DNA showed. The stenciled name in the suitcase fit too. The clothing marked Keene had stumped police for years, but Webb had a sister, and that sister had married a man named Thomas Keene. T. Keene. It gave Abbott a likely source for the name that had sent detectives chasing a stranger who never existed. The last piece was the hardest and the saddest. Why was Carl Webb, an instrument maker from Melbourne, lying dead on a beach in Adelaide with his labels cut off and poison in his body? The research turned up a marriage. Webb had married a woman named Dorothy Robertson in 1941. The marriage was unhappy, and it fell apart. They split up in 1947, the year before he died, and Dorothy moved to South Australia, the same part of the country where his body would later be found. Abbott's own reading is that Webb most likely traveled to Adelaide to look for the wife who was no longer with him. That changes the whole case. The spy theory, which ran the conversation for 50 years, fell away. There is no proof Webb was a spy of any kind. He was a troubled, lonely man who had lost his marriage and traveled across the country, and who ended up dead against a seawall with a dark line of poetry about death hidden in his clothes. Tamam, Shud, ended. Finished, but a name is not the same thing as an answer, and this is where the file is still open. The DNA told us who he was. It did not tell us how he died. The poison the doctor was so sure of has never been found. We still do not know whether Carl Webb's death was something done to him or something he chose. We do not know who cut the labels from his clothing or whether he did it himself, and we do not know why. We do not know how Jessica Thompson's private phone number ended up in his book, or why a woman who said she had never met him looked like she might collapse at the sight of his face. Her family has said, in the years since, that she may have known more than she ever told the police. She took whatever she knew to her grave. There is even a strange final loop in the story. During his years chasing the case, Derek Abbott met and married a woman named Rachel Egan. Egan is descended from Jessica Thompson's son, Robin, the boy whose rare ears and teeth had started the theory that the Somerton man was his father. So the man who finally identified the body had, along the way, married into the very family at the center of the oldest rumor in the case. The DNA side of that question has never been cleanly settled, and the likeness is real, recorded, and rare enough that calling it just chance feels like its own kind of stretch. Two men, two features carried by a tiny part of all people, sitting at the heart of the same mystery. And there is one more thing worth saying plainly. As strong as the answer is, the case has not been officially closed by the authorities. The body was dug up, the lab reports were written, and as of early 2025, the South Australian coroner had still not made a final ruling that officially names the Somerton man and signs off on the cause of death. In the eyes of science, the question of who is answered. In the eyes of the law, the file is still open. So we come back to the plaster face. It still exists. The same cast that Jessica Thompson could not bear to look at. The same plaster that Paul Lawson built over a dead man's face in 1949. The same object people walked past for 50 years without understanding. The hairs caught in it lifted a man named Carl Webb out of being nameless and gave him back the name that had been so carefully stripped away. The blade that cut the labels missed the hair. That is the whole reason we know him at all. A man lay on a beach with no name for almost 3/4 of a century. Now he has one. He has a birthday, a hometown, a trade, a failed marriage, and a reason to have been in the city where he died. What he does not have, even now, is an answer. The poison, the secrecy, the woman who seemed to know a stranger, and the line of poetry rolled up against his ribs. Ended. Finished. The man has a name again. The mystery does not.